her in front of the TV, and when I came back, she'd copied the exact same tiger from the screen. Can you imagine? She was only 3. My mother's favorite story to tell anybody who will listen involves me, some Crayola markers, and Ethelbert the tiger playing on the CBBS. It was apparently that moment when she knew I'd become an artist, and like any mother would, that drawing was tucked away safely for years to come. While I don't remember that moment as well as my mom does, for as long as I can remember, I've been drawing. Whether that meant creating my own comic books and forcing my parents to read them, stealing my mom's valuables for DIY projects, or doodling in the margins of every notebook I've ever owned, something about the process of creating art gives me a feeling of satisfaction that I've never gotten from anything else. Art for me has been the one thing in my life that just clicks. Growing up in India, surrounded by a culture that celebrates art in every aspect of life, through clothes and jewelry, food, music, religion, dance, and so much more, and with artist grandparents and a mom who deeply instilled the love of local artisans and their work into me, it's safe to say that art was my lived experience. However, things quickly changed when my family and I moved to Portland, Oregon. As a kid, I could never find the words to explain the hollow sadness I would feel, and as I got older, the sadness got deeper and much, much longer. 3 months into our move, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. For a 12-year-old who still hadn't figured out how to assimilate into an American middle school, spoiler alert, it's nothing like the Disney Channel, that was really my breaking point. My thoughts grew dark and I started withdrawing more and more into myself. I watched as my sister asked question after question, 10 years old, trying to figure out what exactly was going on with Mama, while I was so scared to even look at her. Because looking at her in her scarf, asleep on our recliner too sick from chemo, would mean acknowledging that the cancer was real. And that was a reality I wasn't ready to face yet. My entire life, my mom had been the most full of life, vibrant person I knew, but the cancer made her weak and tired. And we watched as her hair fell out, and she had to spend hours getting chemo and deal with all the side effects. And we watched her go through radiation and surgery, and then medication, and then wait to see if all of this had even worked. While she never complained or asked why her, I did. I spent nights lying wide awake asking why her. I spent the bus rides to Seattle where my parents would send us almost every weekend, as they spent the days in doctors' offices discussing treatment plans, obsessing over why this was happening to my family. And in a twisted way, it all seemed like my fault. I grew increasingly reclusive and angry. I couldn't understand why I felt this way or how to make it stop. And as I mentioned, I grew up in India, so the concept of mental health was foreign. I had never heard the words depression or anxiety before, and my only experience with mental illness had been watching the media portray quote-unquote crazy people with whom I simply didn't identify with. I turned to self-harm as my method of coping, wearing long sleeves even in 80-degree weather to hide the physical embodiment of my mental state. Reflecting back, in some ways, I think I had romanticized the idea of self-harm and saw it as another form of body art, as a healthy expression of my feelings. You see, in our culture, we don't talk about these things. I had a family who loved me, a roof over my head. I lived in America, the land of opportunity. What did I have to be sad about? I asked myself these questions every single day, in the bathroom stall, during lunch, as I cut to cope with the anxiety of the day. After I was done, I would wipe the blood off my wrists, pull down my sleeves, adjust the strategically worn bracelets, and walk out with a smile plastered on my face. Much like a lot of people suffering from mental illness, I was really good, almost too good, at putting on a mask to hide my reality. From the outside looking in, one would never be able to tell that it took physical exertion just to lift my head off the pillow and face the world every single day, or that the 15-minute bathroom breaks that I took in the middle of class were actually just panic attacks that I was experiencing almost daily. My parents, focused on my mom's illness, chalked up my withdrawal to just being a teenager. But it was so much more than that. It was this constant state of agony, this never-ending feeling that I needed to be anywhere but here. It would keep me up for days at a time, and when I got sick of lying in bed, I'd sneak out and walk the roads of my neighborhood, sometimes till 3 or 4 in the morning. wishing that the gravel would open up and I would fall through to an alternate universe where I was someone different, living a completely different life. But it never did. And so I sought control over my life in other ways. Cutting was one, but food and eating were another. Starving myself, eating only Tic Tacs for lunch, chugging water when I felt dizzy, throwing up after dinner, obsessively weighing myself. Whatever it was, I did it. And the more I did it, the more I couldn't stop doing it. The ugliness I felt on the inside made me feel so ugly on the outside, and I thought that if I could just lose that last little bit or get a little bit skinnier, maybe I'll finally be happy and everything will be okay. My life would be perfect. I stalked thinspo pages on Instagram and was bewitched by accounts titled Pretty Girls Don't Eat on Tumblr, and as I scrolled, all I could think about was how much I hated myself and how much I hated myself for feeling that way. Eventually, the darkness boiled over, leading to a suicide attempt at age 13. My parents had gone to watch my sister's soccer game. I probably made up some excuse about homework as a way to skip out. I don't remember very much from this day. I don't know if this is something I'd been planning for a long time or how I gotten the pills, but all I remember is in that moment looking down at the bottle and making the very conscious decision to take as many as I could. It wasn't until after that I realized I couldn't keep going the way that I had been. I thought about Anthra, my little sister, being the one to find me. What would that have done to her? What would her life look like if I had died that day? I went to school that Monday and told my counselor, Mr. Everson, everything. I thought I'd be told to toughen up, or be called dramatic, overly sensitive, or doing it for attention, the only phrases I'd ever heard in conjunction with suicide. But instead he asked me how long I'd felt like this. And after thinking about it for a couple moments, I responded, "It feels like forever." I sat there in disbelief and embarrassment. I couldn't believe that I had just said everything that I had said, after keeping it in for years. And he responded, "I just want you to know it takes an incredibly brave person to recognize that they need help, and I am so, so proud of you for coming in here today." For the first time since I stepped into his office, I began to cry. That night, as I lay in my bed, pretending to be asleep, I heard my parents come into my room. As they got closer to the bed, they saw one of my arms laying across the quilt covered in fresh cuts. It was the first time in my life that I'd ever heard my dad cry. "How did we not see this?" he asked my mom as tears streamed down both of their faces. I was so ashamed, terrified that I'd let my parents, who had done nothing but love and support me their whole lives, who had moved halfway across the world just so I could have better opportunities that they didn't even dream of having, down. How could I explain to them that this wasn't their fault, that there was just something fundamentally wrong with me and I didn't know why? Therapy was like learning a foreign language for my parents and I. They didn't understand why I couldn't just talk to them. Why did I have to talk about our personal problems and family baggage to someone they didn't know, while I tried to figure out how I was supposed to talk to a stranger about my most dark, twisted thoughts or why that would help me? Therapy wasn't meant for people like us. It was meant for white people who needed someone to listen to them complain because they weren't close to their families. Or at least that's what I'd picked up listening to aunties and uncles talk about so-and-so with a therapist. They always whispered when they said therapist, like it was a dirty curse word that they didn't want to be caught saying. When my therapist told my parents that I needed to be checked into the pediatric psych unit because I was a threat to myself, my mom held on to me so tight I almost couldn't breathe. "I'll watch her all the time. I'll sleep in her room every single night, and we'll get rid of all the medications and the knives and whatever it is that we need to do, but we can't send her away. It's my job to take care of her." It wasn't until my therapist threatened to call Child Protective Services that my parents and I took that drive to Legacy Emmanuel, and I felt like the biggest failure in the world the entire way there. I spent 2 weeks in that psych unit, and my family was there every day during visiting hours to the point where they had to be kicked out to leave. It was during that time that I realized the stress and turmoil that this was taking on everyone else, and I realized that if I couldn't do it for myself, I needed to be better for them. I would say that those 2 weeks were the beginning of my turning point. Music was an outlet for me. I'd never really been musically inclined, but bands like Pierce the Veil and Bring Me the Horizon created songs with lyrics that explained exactly how I felt but didn't know how to vocalize to others. Quickly, I became more and more captivated by the world of alternative music, and these musicians became my role models. They spoke candidly about their own experiences as teenagers struggling with mental illness, and within them, I found a community. Something most of these musicians had in common were their heavily tattooed appearances, and I became almost obsessed with their body art. In a way, it reminded me of a more permanent version of Mandi, a type of semi permanent Indian tattoo. It started off as me just doodling on my palm during class with a pen, but I instantly noticed how creating these repetitive Mandi patterns calmed me down and distracted me. This then evolved to creating bigger and bigger pieces all over my arms with a Sharpie. Soon this became my new go-to. At the slightest feeling of anxiety or urge to cut, I would pull out a marker and begin to draw on myself. It seems small, but in that moment it felt like I had reconnected with a part of me that had been missing for so long. In high school, I threw myself into the arts program, yearning for those 90 minutes where I could just disappear into the art building and forget everything else that was going on. College, however, was different. Overwhelmed by once again having to start over and figure myself out, my art took a back seat. When asked, "What are you working on now?" or "Why did you stop drawing? You were so good," I felt such a deep shame. Embarrassed that I had claimed this part of my identity for the past 4 years, only to let it go without a second thought. I don't know why I stopped drawing. It seems trivial to say that I just got busy, but I guess in a way I associated being an artist as being in high school, and freshman year of college was spent so desperately trying to distance myself from who I used to be. High school wasn't easy, and moving across the country for college was supposed to be my fresh start. The time for me to finally live the life I had been dreaming of living for years. However, life has a funny way of throwing big, altering curveballs when you least expect it. We first heard we would have to move back in October 2019, about 2 months into my freshman year of college. There's a backlog in processing green cards right now, my dad explained to me as we drove to the airport at the end of fall break. In theory, the problem seemed simple. Our visas were expiring, and the hold in the immigration system meant we wouldn't be receiving our permanent residency in time, which meant we would have to leave the U.S. But the reality of this situation consumed our family for the following 10 months. It meant my dad leaving the U.S. for 3 months in a last-ditch effort to extend our visas, and my mom staying up for nights on end coordinating calls between lawyers and time zones while trying to comprehend complex legal jargon. It meant my sister having to go to school every day knowing that the senior year she'd been dreaming about for the past 3 years would no longer be a possibility. For me, it meant watching my family fall apart while I was 2,000 miles away and trying to balance my life at college at the same time. Every conversation back home revolved around new updates from the lawyers, trying to learn the names of different immigration forms, and trying to build somewhat of a timeline for a situation none of us could possibly control. After months in limbo, moving to Amsterdam was the only solution we could think of, and although it felt like a weight was lifted, my family and I prepared to move across the world once again. Depression for me has always manifested itself in a self-imposed quarantine, whether that meant not leaving my bed for days or the mental barrier between who I was and who I presented myself to be. A part of me has always been shielding itself from the world. As I met and talked to more people dealing with mental illness, it seemed like a common thread between all of us, shutting down parts of ourselves just to get through the day. Isolation and loneliness are some of the most common symptoms of depressive episodes, symptoms that I've grown all too familiar with over the years. However, this time was different. Since COVID had showed no signs of improving, my university decided to move into an online module for the semester, a decision that led me to take a semester off from school just to recuperate from the strain of the past 10 months. At least that was the idea. Fall semester 2020, I felt more reclusive than I ever had before. The uncertainty of this pandemic and having to separate myself from the identity of being a student for the first time in almost 13 years triggered daily panic attacks. Unlike before when I chose to detach from the world, now I had no choice. Trying to make friends, explore this new city, or anything else was virtually impossible, and there were days when I didn't even leave my bed because I didn't see the point. I could go to sleep for 2 whole weeks and nothing in my life would change, I described to my parents, who, terrified, watched me shut down once again. 3 months into my hibernation, I decided to, during my 8th hour of mindlessly scrolling through social media, that what I needed was a project, something to look forward to wake up to every morning. Thus, my quarantine sketchbook came to be. I committed to trying to fill as many pages of that sketchbook until I had to go back to school, and would spend hours of my day sitting in my room with my supplies spread around me, music blaring, and I'd never felt more like myself. While this didn't erase the loneliness, I was finally creating art just to create it. It wasn't a school project or a grade or a therapy mandated coping mechanism. It was just me doing something I loved simply because I wanted to. Flipping through those pages now, almost a year later, it's pretty startling to see how different my life is. Each sketch is representative of how hopeless and lost I was feeling, and looking back now, I can't describe how it makes me feel. It kind of goes something like, oh shit, I really did that. Like for most of us, this pandemic was a period of painful self-discovery and growth, leading to me to come to terms with a lot of things that I had spent many years avoiding. But now, as I enter adulthood and my junior year of college with a newfound sense of confidence and self-assuredness, I look back at the terrified, unsure freshman girl who was sent home with no idea what was in store for her, and I can't help but be so proud of her and her resilience through what was going to be some of the darkest moments she had ever faced. As unstable and isolating as this time has been, it's shown me that I can be independent and somewhat okay on my own. Even though the days haven't always been the brightest, COVID has changed all of us in some way, and for me, that's been realizing that the person I've always wanted to be is myself. As I move forward, I have this new sense of hope for the future. Anyone who knows me knows I struggle with control, and more specifically, losing control. I like to know exactly what's going to happen, why it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and who it's going to happen with. I had a plan for my entire life, the next 10 years, a plan for the next 5 years, the next 1 year, the next month, and then also the next week. But if this time has taught me anything, it's that those plans don't matter. I never thought I'd be living in Amsterdam, or take a semester off, or not be friends with people that I thought I'd be friends with for the rest of my life. But plans change. People change. I changed. 4 years ago, if you had told me I would be an ASHA storyteller, I would have laughed in your face. But the opportunities this organization has given me since I was 17 years old, meeting the people I've gotten to meet and hearing all the amazing, inspiring stories I've heard all over the world, has been nothing short of healing. I'm an entirely different person than I was in 2017 at my first ASHA event, a scared little 17-year-old who thought this would be the first and last time she ever did something like this. Little did I know. This organization, the people in it, people like all of you here today, have given me hope, and I hope that being here does the same for you. If my COVID sketchbook taught me anything, it's that life is too short not to do the things that make us feel like who we are. We don't outgrow them, and they will always be there. So maybe I didn't go to art school and become the famous painter I'd always wanted to be, but I'm still an artist, even if it took me a little bit of time to recognize that. As we grow older, life gets busier, our problems get more complicated, and responsibilities get in the way. But still, I urge you all to find your own version of your sketchbook, something that lets you just be. Maybe it's a discarded hobby from your childhood, or something you've always wanted to try but been too scared to do and didn't. If these times have taught us anything, it's that things can change in the blink of an eye, and all we really have is right now. So as I leave you here today, all I have to say is don't wait. Take time for yourself, and maybe you'll discover a piece of yourself that has been missing all along.